Hello, my name is Brad. This is a presentation on trickling water when comparing it through a 2D array compared to a 3D array. So we were given a class assignment to make a 2D array that would simulate water trickling through a porous substance. And we would have to make the array ourselves by making either a fixed porosity or a fixed probability array to where you'd put in a probability of how porous the array would be, and then it would simulate real quickly a new generated array, and then also would make the water trickle down. You can see what one looks like right here. This is a much bigger one than what was required. This is 100 by 100. Exactly just what it means by seeing if it trickled down. You can see a nice little path going through here, but all the other paths dead ended. And then once we knew we had a 2D array that could actually work, we then were to make this 2D array happen over 1,000 times across multiple levels of porosity. And then that would give us a probability of flow for each instance of that porosity and porous substance. It was the general class had to make that and whatnot, but we also had to come up with a new experiment that would piggyback off of that idea. And to me, the most natural idea that came after that would be to make another dimension, to make it a 3D map. And I mean, you can see that I have something right here, but like the idea here was to understand whether or not if it was 3D, if flow would happen more likely with the same porosity, or flow would happen less likely at the same porosity. I wasn't sure. I just figured that 3D would be so much more different than what we were seeing with 2D graphs. But the challenge of 3D that was like super intimidating was actually creating the 3D, because there's just so much more involved the second you get that new dimension of depth going in there. And so I had to really break down what I wanted to program and what I wanted it to look like. And so you can see right here, I just essentially thought of a 2D graph and added layers to it. And once I could get that idea of just being like, okay, just make 2D just a whole bunch of different times, it kind of got easier the more I worked on it. And I think I had a good way to explain this and help everyone else visualize what was going on in my mind. So we should start off with just what the 2D graph looks like. Now, this is essentially how, a simulated of flow in 2D, but I wanted it to work in 3D as well. So I just imagined having to pop it out, and then that each one of those squares became a block. And from those blocks, I would imagine two different things, or I would imagine the flow would have to start going down one layer and then branch outward from there, going forwards, left, right, backwards. And then once it found the different places that it could go from there, it would go down one layer. And then if it could go down one layer, if it couldn't, then it'd stop. It'd act like as if it was a wall going left or right. But if it could go down one layer, then it would start the process over again of seeing if it could go left or right, or if it would go down another layer. And then this process just would repeat over and over and over again until it finally reached the bottom. And then if it reached the bottom, I knew that flow happened. And that just was applied throughout the whole 3D map. Iteratively, it would go through each one of those layers of 2D arrays and just try and see if it could reach the bottom of the 3D graph. So once I had that going, I then had to test if this 3D model and its flow was actually correct and if it actually worked. So one of the tests I did was actually just shrinking it back down to a 2D graph and running the simulations against a 2D graph or the 2D code that I knew worked. And so here in red, you can see the 3D actual numbers being plot up against the 2D simulation numbers. And you can see that this is pretty much a dead-on comparison right here. It almost looks like I just ran the 2D simulation just twice, and I made sure to do it with different numbers, and it just always matched up amazingly well. And so from there, I was like, okay, time to step up the next test, and that is to actually run a 3D array compared to a 2D array. And so when I did that, I almost thought that they were like that. When I saw this, I thought that the numbers were going to be exactly the same. So I ran it a couple times and it always ended up with this same silhouette. So I noticed that, okay, they are different results. And when I compared them to, other numbers that had the same similar pattern of a number to the third degree compared to, number times number, it kind of ended up with this same kind of pattern, this gap in between of the 3D array and the 2D array, and whatnot. But it showed the code is working and that there is a difference between the 2D simulated results and the 3D simulated results. But when doing this, I started noticing that that these results looked awfully similar. This right here looks very, very close to what the 3D, or I mean the 3x3 2D graph looks like. It just looked a little bit further on, and and this pattern of this gap seemed like it could be closed. So I wanted to know what is separating this 2D graph from the 3D graph. Can this be compensated? Because the pattern looked like it was so similar that there had to be a connection there. So I did some thinking, and I think I found a pretty good way to visualize what was going on, or at least in my head, in my problem solving. That the 3D graph was very similar to the 2D graph. But I was theorizing that because the 2D doesn't have as many blocks, that what if I made the 2D just as big as the 3D to compensate for the volume? So I just imagined that it would shift, that I would take a layer of the 3D and just move it over to the side. And then that's the same volume as a 3D graph, right? And when I ran that simulation of what a 2x4 would look like next to a 2x2x2, the results looked exactly the same, almost as great as it did when I had only when I was doing one dimension 3D compared to a 2D graph. And so after the results were so good there, I was like, all right, let's keep on going, seeing if they scale. 3x3x3 array compared to a 3x9 array, the results were also still great. And I felt like I found the answer. But as I continued to test and iterate, when I went to a 5x5x5 array compared to a 5x25 array, I started getting a little bit of a gap there. Is there something more that I'm missing? And so I ran it again for a 10x10 by 10 array compared to a 10 by 100 array. And then I'd noticed the gap was much bigger. With that, I noticed that that there was a diverging pattern that was becoming more and more present that I couldn't solve. Even though there's this divergence happening in these compensated 3D and 2D graphs, I do think that there is a correlation, or to where you could still make these 2D graphs correlate with a 3D graph pretty well. I just don't know what the answer is right now. But it does present an opportunity to find the answer eventually. And eventually means by the next extended research when we look into this further. And we do see a difference in 3D and 2D when compared to 2D. We do see a correlation between the two. And in small arrays, it can be compensated for. And your 2D array could be almost exactly used as a 3D array. You just got to account for the volume difference. But when you start getting a little bit higher, the 3D arrays do matter. And I think it has to do with the fact that there's more possibilities of flow to happen. As for a 2D array, it can only go left, right, and down. A 3D array has 3 more options that the 2D array does not have. It can go forward, backwards, left, right, and down. And I think that's where a bunch of the differences start to really matter when the array gets bigger. That was my presentation. I hope you enjoyed it. Yeah, thank you.